Colonel John Warden sat down with a small team in the Pentagon during the first week of August 1990 and sketched out an air campaign that would fundamentally change how America fights wars. And within 6 months, his ideas would be tested against the fourth largest army on Earth, with results that shocked military planners around the world. What Warden and his team created was called Instant Thunder, a deliberate contrast to Operation Rolling Thunder, the gradual and ultimately unsuccessful bombing campaign against North Vietnam. And the name alone told you everything about what they were trying to do differently. No more incremental escalation, no more political micromanagement of targets, no more hoping the enemy would eventually tire of the pain. This was going to be overwhelming force applied with surgical precision to paralyze the Iraqi war machine in a matter of days rather than years. The whole world was about to see what modern air power could actually accomplish when it was unleashed without restraint. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990, and within hours, his forces had completely overrun the small, oil-rich nation. Kuwait had been a British protectorate carved out of the Ottoman Empire, and Saddam had long argued that it was historically part of Iraq, that the border was an artificial creation of colonial powers. But the real issue was money and oil. Iraq owed Kuwait $14 billion from the 8-year war against Iran, debt that Saddam believed should be forgiven since Iraq had been fighting to protect the entire Arab world from Iranian Islamic fundamentalism. Kuwait refused to forgive the debt, and worse, the Kuwaitis were overproducing oil, driving down prices and strangling the Iraqi economy at the very moment it was trying to recover from that devastating war. Saddam saw this as economic warfare, and he decided to solve his problems the old-fashioned way, with tanks and infantry and overwhelming military force. The invasion itself lasted barely 12 hours. Iraqi Republican Guard units rolled across the border before dawn and simply crushed everything in their path. The Kuwaiti military, such as it was, never had a chance. By nightfall, Saddam Hussein controlled the world's second-largest oil reserves and was positioned to threaten the world's largest, the Saudi oil fields that lay just across the border to the south. The strategic implications were staggering. If Saddam moved into Saudi Arabia, and there was nothing in the region capable of stopping him if he did, he would control roughly 40% of the world's proven oil reserves. The global economy ran on oil, still does, and whoever controlled that much of the supply could dictate terms to the entire industrialized world. This wasn't just about Kuwait or even about the Middle East. This was about the fundamental architecture of the international system that had emerged after World War II. And the first President Bush understood immediately that letting Saddam get away with this conquest would invite similar adventures by every strong man with an army and a neighbor with something worth taking. The United States had to respond, but what kind of response would actually work? The American military's existing plans for the region, known as OPLAN 1002-90, were primarily defensive in nature, designed to slow down a Soviet invasion through Iran until reinforcements could arrive. Those plans were completely inadequate for driving Saddam out of Kuwait. General Norman Schwarzkopf, who commanded U.S. Central Command, and therefore had responsibility for the Middle East, told the Pentagon he needed offensive options, and he needed them fast. That's where John Warden came in. Warden was a colonel running the Directorate of War-Fighting Concepts on the Air Staff, an organization called Checkmate that had originally been created to plan for conflict with the Soviet Union, but had more recently been refocused on other strategic challenges. Warden was an unusual officer, an intellectual who had written his thesis at the National War College about air power theory, and then turned it into a published book called the air campaign. He believed deeply that air power, properly applied, could win wars by itself, that you didn't need to destroy an enemy's army if you could destroy his ability to command and control that army. He had developed what he called the 5 rings model, which imagined an enemy nation as a series of concentric circles. At the center was leadership, the brains of the operation. Surrounding that were critical infrastructure, transportation networks, population centers, and finally, at the outer ring, the fielded military forces. Traditional military thinking focused on that outer ring, on destroying enemy armies in the field. Worden argued that this was backwards, that you should attack from the inside out, decapitating the leadership and paralyzing the command structure so that the enemy's army became irrelevant even if it was still technically intact. The name Instant Thunder was Worden's direct repudiation of Rolling Thunder, the Vietnam-era bombing campaign that had killed thousands of Americans and accomplished almost nothing because it was applied gradually and gave the enemy time to adapt. Instant Thunder would be different. It called for a massive, simultaneous attack by 500 combat aircraft that would, in Worden's estimation, destroy Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war within 6 to 9 days. The plan didn't even include attacks on the Iraqi army in Kuwait because Worden believed it wouldn't be necessary. Once Saddam was cut off from his forces, once his communications were destroyed and his command bunkers were rubble, the army would simply cease to function as a coherent military organization. It was a bold theory, and like most bold theories, it was partly wrong and partly revolutionary. General Chuck Horner was not impressed when he first saw Instant Thunder. Horner was a 4-star general commanding 9th Air Force and U.S. Central Command Air Forces, which meant he was the man who would actually have to execute whatever plan came down from Washington. He was also a combat veteran who had flown Wild Weasel missions over North Vietnam, deliberately drawing enemy fire to locate and destroy surface-to-air missile sites, one of the most dangerous jobs in aerial warfare. Horner had earned 2 Silver Stars and the Distinguished Flying Cross, doing things that most people couldn't imagine, and he wasn't about to accept some theoretical framework dreamed up by staff officers who might never have been shot at. When Worden flew to Riyadh to brief Horner on Instant Thunder in late August 1990, the reception was chilly. Horner's main objection was that the plan completely ignored the Iraqi army, those hundreds of thousands of troops dug in along the Kuwaiti border who represented the most immediate and dangerous threat to coalition forces. You couldn't just wave your hands and declare the army irrelevant because you were going to bomb some headquarters buildings in Baghdad. Those soldiers had tanks and artillery and the ability to kill a lot of Americans if they decided to move Saudi Arabia. Horner sent Worden back to Washington and put together his own planning team to expand and revise the air campaign into something that would actually work in the real world. The team was called the Black Hole, a deliberately obscure name for the small group that worked in secrecy to develop the most comprehensive air operation in military history. Led by Brigadier General Buster Glosson and Lieutenant Colonel David Deptula, who had been one of Worden's key planners on Instant Thunder, the Black Hole took the core concepts of Worden's plan and built something far more ambitious around them. The expanded plan had 4 distinct phases. Phase 1 would establish air supremacy by destroying Iraq's integrated air defense network, known as KARI, and grounding the Iraqi Air Force through attacks on airfields, hangars, and command centers. Phase 2 would target strategic facilities including weapons production plants, nuclear and chemical warfare sites, and government buildings. Phase 3 would go after the Iraqi army's supply lines, cutting them off from ammunition, fuel, and food. And Phase 4 which Worden had wanted to skip entirely, would pound the Iraqi ground forces until they were so weakened and demoralized that the ground campaign would be a walkover rather than a bloodbath. The original Instant Thunder plan had 84 targets. By the time fighting began on January 17, 1991, the Air Tasking Order listed 476 targets for the first day alone. By the end of the war, targets were numbered in the thousands. This wasn't just Worden's vision anymore. It was something much bigger and more comprehensive, a campaign that integrated strategic bombing with tactical support for ground forces, that used the F-117 stealth fighter for precision strikes on downtown Baghdad, while A-10 Warthogs and Apache helicopters hunted tanks in the desert. It was Worden's theory, combined with Horner's operational experience and the combined wisdom of thousands of planners, pilots, and intelligence analysts who spent months getting ready for what was to come. The buildup in Saudi Arabia was the largest and fastest military deployment in American history. An operation called Desert Shield that eventually put more than 500,000 American troops, 14,000 tanks, tens of thousands of trucks, and over 1,400 aircraft into the theater of operations. The logistics alone were staggering, the kind of undertaking that only a handful of nations in history have ever been capable of executing. Everything from tanks and aircraft to toilet paper and drinking water had to be transported halfway around the world and then distributed to hundreds of thousands of troops spread across a desert the size of Texas. The first forces arrived within days of the invasion. F-15 Eagles from Langley Air Force Base that flew halfway around the world in a single 14-hour flight with multiple aerial refuelings, landing in Saudi Arabia, armed and ready to fight their way in if the Iraqis hadn't stopped at the Kuwaiti border. That deployment, 48 Eagles flying non-stop from Virginia to Saudi Arabia in what was the longest fighter deployment in history at that time, demonstrated something important about American military capability. The United States could project power anywhere in the world on extremely short notice. And that power could arrive ready to fight, not needing days or weeks to assemble and prepare before it could be effective. Those first F-15s were essentially a tripwire, a signal that the United States was committed, and that any further Iraqi advance would mean war with America. They were the only force in the theater capable of stopping an Iraqi armored thrust into Saudi Arabia during those first critical days. And everyone knew that if Saddam had kept moving, those pilots might have been ordered to fly suicidal missions against overwhelming numbers just to buy time for reinforcements to arrive. Fortunately, Saddam stopped at the Kuwaiti border, probably because his supply lines were already stretched to their limit and he couldn't sustain a further advance. But nobody knew that for certain at the time. The pilots who landed in Dhahran on August 7th knew they might be the only thing standing between the Iraqi Republican Guard and the Saudi oil fields, and they were ready to do whatever was necessary. Behind those first Eagles came wave after wave of additional forces. Soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines, ships loaded with tanks and armored vehicles, cargo planes delivering supplies at a rate that averaged one landing every 22 minutes around the clock. The C-5 Galaxy and C-141 Starlifter cargo aircraft formed what pilots called an aluminum bridge between the United States and Saudi Arabia, an unbroken stream of aircraft that ran continuously for months. The Navy's Sealift Command moved the heavy equipment that was too big or too numerous to fly, tank after tank and truck after truck, loaded onto cargo ships for the weeks-long voyage to the Persian Gulf. It was an astonishing logistical achievement, moving that many people and that much equipment across that distance, and then sustaining them in a hostile desert environment for half a year, while the diplomats tried to find a peaceful solution, and the planners prepared for war. The chaos was incredible in those first weeks, the kind of confusion that happens whenever any large military operation spins up from a standing start. Cargo planes landed at empty airfields while soldiers stood waiting at other airfields for planes that never arrived. Equipment was loaded onto the wrong aircraft and ended up at the wrong destination. Orders were issued from Central Command and then lost or ignored or countermanded by someone down the chain who thought they had a better idea. General Schwarzkopf cut through the confusion with a simple list of priorities. He wanted fighting men first, followed by tank-killing aircraft, specifically the AH-64 Apache helicopter and the A-10 Thunderbolt. With those assets in theater, Saddam's offensive options would narrow considerably, and the coalition could afford the time it would take to sort out the logistics and bring in the rest of the force. The deployment continued through the fall and into the winter, and by November, President Bush had decided to double the size of American forces in the Gulf, shifting from a purely defensive posture to one that could actually drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait. This wasn't just about adding more troops, though that was part of it. It was about bringing in the heavy armored divisions and the additional air power that would be needed for offensive operations. The 7th Corps, which had been stationed in Germany to defend against a Soviet invasion that was now obviously never going to happen, was pulled out of Europe and shipped to Saudi Arabia with all of its tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles and self-propelled artillery. It was the kind of deployment that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier, when those units were considered essential to NATO's defense. But the Cold War was over, and the threat had shifted to a different part of the world. By January 1991, the coalition had assembled the most powerful military force since World War II. Nearly 30 nations had contributed troops or equipment or financial support to the effort. A genuine international coalition, rather than a unilateral American operation with token Allied participation. The Saudis and Kuwaitis and Germans and Japanese together financed about 2/3 of the cost of the operation, which was appropriate given that their oil supplies were the ones most directly threatened by Saddam's aggression. British Tornado aircraft flew alongside American F-15s. French Jaguars attacked targets in Kuwait. Saudi F-15s conducted air defense missions over their own territory. The coalition wasn't just an American show, with some flags from other countries to make it look legitimate. It was a genuine, multinational effort coordinated by American commanders who understood that maintaining Allied unity was just as important as winning battles. The Iraqi Air Force was not a joke. On paper, it was the 6th largest air force in the world, with over 700 combat aircraft, including some genuinely formidable machines. The MiG-29 Fulcrum was considered one of the best fighters the Soviet Union had ever produced, highly maneuverable with infrared search and track sensors that could find targets without tipping off radar warning receivers. The MiG-25 Foxbat could fly higher and faster than any American fighter. And while it was an interceptor rather than a dogfighter, it posed a serious threat to high-value assets like AWACS aircraft and refueling tankers that were essential to coalition operations. The French-built Mirage F-1s were equipped with modern air-to-air missiles and could operate in both air superiority and ground attack roles. The Iraqis also had extensive surface-to-air missile coverage, thousands of anti-aircraft guns, and a command and control network that was one of the most sophisticated outside of NATO. Baghdad itself was more heavily defended than Hanoi had been during the Vietnam War, protected by 65% of Iraq's surface-to-air missiles and more than half of its anti-aircraft artillery. American planners expected heavy casualties. General Schwarzkopf ordered 20,000 hospital beds and deployed 6 large hospital ships in preparation for the wounded. An elaborate medevac operation was established based on estimates that the fighting would be brutal and prolonged. Some intelligence assessments predicted that the air campaign alone could cost the coalition dozens of aircraft in the first few days. And nobody knew what would happen when the ground war started against an Iraqi army that had 8 years of combat experience from the war with Iran. Those estimates would prove to be wildly pessimistic. But nobody knew that yet. The men who would fly the first missions over Baghdad knew they were heading into the most heavily defended airspace they had ever faced. And they knew that some of them wouldn't be coming back. The United Nations gave Saddam Hussein until January 15, 1991, to withdraw from Kuwait. Nobody expected him to comply, and nobody was surprised when midnight came and went without any movement from the Iraqi forces. In fact, far from withdrawing, Saddam had spent the previous 6 months massively reinforcing his positions in Kuwait, building elaborate fortifications along the Saudi border that the media breathlessly described as impenetrable sand walls, backed by anti-tank ditches, minefields, and entrenched infantry supported by dug-in armor and artillery. A frontal assault against those defenses would have been catastrophically expensive for coalition forces. But the war wasn't going to start on the ground. At 2:38 a.m. Baghdad time on January 17, 1991, Task Force Normandy crossed into Iraqi airspace. This was a combined force of 8 Army AH-64 Apache attack helicopters led by 4 Air Force MH-53 Pavlo helicopters, and their mission was to blow a hole in the Iraqi air defense network. They were targeting 2 early warning radar sites in the western Iraqi desert that formed a critical link in the KARI system, sites that would detect coalition aircraft crossing the border and alert the air defense network throughout the country. The Apaches destroyed both radar sites in less than 4 minutes, firing Hellfire missiles from close range in an attack that the Iraqis never saw coming. That was the signal. Across Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf, hundreds of aircraft were already in the air or preparing to launch. Within minutes of Task Force Normandy's attack, Major Gregory Feast dropped the first bomb of Operation Desert Storm from his F-117 stealth fighter, destroying an Iraqi Air Force Intercept Operations Center that was another link in the air defense chain. 10 F-117s in total hit targets in and around Baghdad that first night, slipping through the most heavily defended airspace in the region completely undetected. The Iraqis didn't know they were under attack until the bombs started exploding. The F-117 Nighthawk was the world's first operational stealth aircraft, developed in absolute secrecy during the Carter administration and not publicly acknowledged until 1988. Its angular, faceted shape was designed to deflect radar energy away from receivers rather than back toward them, making it virtually invisible to the air defense systems of the era. The aircraft was ugly by conventional standards, earning the nickname Wobblin' Goblin from pilots who found it tricky to fly. But it could do something no other aircraft in the world could do: fly over downtown Baghdad in the middle of a war and drop precision-guided bombs through specific doorways and ventilation shafts without ever being tracked by radar. The development of the F-117 was one of the most closely guarded secrets in American military history. The Skunk Works team at Lockheed, the legendary Advanced Development Group that had produced the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird, started working on stealth technology in the mid-1970s, after a breakthrough discovery by one of their engineers who realized that certain angular shapes could dramatically reduce radar returns. The first prototype, codenamed Have Blue, flew in 1977, and the first operational F-117 was delivered to the Air Force in 1982. For the next 6 years, the aircraft flew only at night from a secret base in Nevada, its existence hidden from the American public and from America's adversaries alike. The pilots who flew the F-117 during those early years couldn't even tell their families what they did for a living. They would disappear to Nevada for weeks at a time, training in simulators and flying actual missions only after dark, when satellite surveillance couldn't observe their aircraft. The base they flew from, officially known as Tonopah Test Range, but referred to by crews as the Ranch, was so secret that even the families of the pilots didn't know exactly where their husbands and fathers were stationed. This level of secrecy was considered essential because the Air Force knew that if the Soviets ever learned what the F-117 could do, they would immediately begin working on countermeasures. By keeping the aircraft hidden, the Air Force preserved its surprise value for the day when it would actually be needed in combat. That day came on December 19, 1989, when 2 F-117s attacked military targets in Panama during Operation Just Cause, the first combat use of stealth aircraft. But Panama was a sideshow compared to what was coming, a limited operation against an opponent with minimal air defenses. Desert Storm would be the real test of whether stealth technology could deliver on its promises against a modern integrated air defense system. On that first night over Baghdad, while Iraqi gunners filled the sky with anti-aircraft fire, shooting blindly at targets they could hear but couldn't see, F-117 pilots calmly destroyed command bunkers, communication centers, and air defense installations across the capital. The footage that emerged in the following days, infrared video showing laser-guided bombs flying through the front doors of buildings or down ventilation shafts into underground bunkers, changed the way the world thought about air power. This wasn't carpet bombing, wasn't the kind of area destruction that had leveled cities in World War II. This was surgical, precise, almost clinical in its efficiency. One target, one bomb, and the target was simply gone, while the building next door remained intact. The targeting accuracy of the F-117 was almost unbelievable to people who had grown up with images of World War II bomb damage. Entire city blocks reduced to rubble in the effort to destroy a single factory or railroad yard. The GBU-27 Paveway 3 laser-guided bomb that the F-117 carried could penetrate several feet of reinforced concrete before detonating, destroying hardened bunkers that had been built to withstand conventional bombing. Iraqi commanders who thought their underground command centers were safe from air attack learned otherwise when 2,000-pound bombs came through the roof and detonated inside their supposedly impregnable fortresses. The psychological impact was enormous, perhaps even greater than the physical destruction. If the Americans could hit a specific ventilation shaft on a specific building in downtown Baghdad without anyone knowing they were there until the bombs exploded, where was safe? What could you hide from an enemy who could see in the dark and strike without warning? The answer, as Iraqi leaders quickly discovered, was that nothing was safe and you couldn't hide anywhere. The F-117S flew every night for the duration of the war, hitting the most dangerous targets in downtown Baghdad, while other aircraft dealt with less defended objectives elsewhere. Only 36 Nighthawks participated in Desert Storm, representing less than 2.5% of the coalition's tactical aircraft. But on the first day of the war, they attacked 31% of the targets. During the first 24 hours, 30 F-117s struck 37 high-value targets across Iraq, and not a single one was lost. Without those F-117s going downtown Baghdad on the first night, Without the stealth aircraft blinding and paralyzing the Iraqi command and control system, coalition aircraft would have had to deal with 7,000 radar-guided missiles, 9,000 infrared missiles, 7,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 800 fighter aircraft, all coordinated by the sophisticated Khe air defense network. Instead, the network was decapitated before it could ever respond effectively, and coalition losses throughout the war remained astonishingly low. Not a single F-117 was lost in combat during the entire campaign, an achievement that would have seemed impossible to anyone familiar with the casualty rates of previous air campaigns against heavily defended targets. While the F-117S were hitting Baghdad, cruise missiles were hitting it too. BGM-109, Tomahawk missiles launched from Navy ships in the Gulf and Red Sea streaked toward strategic targets at low altitude, their computerized guidance systems comparing terrain features to digital maps stored in their memories to navigate with astonishing precision. The Tomahawks had 1,000-pound warheads and could strike targets hundreds of miles away without risking a pilot's life, making them ideal for the most dangerous first strike missions. More than $380 million worth of cruise missiles were fired at Iraq in the first 3 days of the war alone, and their effectiveness remains somewhat controversial. The Pentagon never released complete statistics on Tomahawk performance, though one post-war analysis suggested that half the missiles never reached their intended targets for various reasons, including navigation errors and mechanical failures. But even missiles that missed contributed to the overall chaos of those opening hours, filling the Baghdad sky with explosions that kept air defense crews confused and unable to organize an effective response. The opening attacks on the Khe air defense network were remarkably successful. Iraqi radar operators quickly learned that turning on their equipment meant attracting HARM missiles, high-speed anti-radiation missiles that homed in on radar signals and destroyed the source within seconds. The F-4G Wild Weasels fired 118 HARM missiles on the first night alone, and after that, many Iraqi radar crews simply refused to turn on their equipment at all. Without radar, the surface-to-air missiles that were supposed to protect Iraqi airspace were nearly useless, unable to track or target the coalition aircraft streaming overhead. The integrated air defense system that was supposed to make Baghdad one of the most dangerous places in the world for enemy aircraft was effectively neutralized within the first 48 hours of the war. Air superiority came even faster than the planners had dared to hope. The Iraqi Air Force, that sixth largest air force in the world, barely got off the ground. When Iraqi fighters did manage to launch, they found themselves facing F-15 Eagles vectored onto them by AWACS aircraft that could see everything that was happening in the sky. The F-15C was designed from the ground up for air superiority, equipped with powerful radar and beyond visual range missiles that could kill enemy aircraft from 25 miles away. Iraqi pilots, who had trained with Soviet advisors in rigid, inflexible tactics and had poor situational awareness compared to their American opponents, were hopelessly outmatched. Captain John Kelk scored the first aerial kill of the war early on the morning of January 17th, destroying an Iraqi MiG-29 with an AIM-7 Sparrow missile. It was the first American air-to-air kill in an F-15 and the first of many to come. By the end of the war, F-15s would account for 33 of the 38 coalition air-to-air victories, with not a single F-15C lost in aerial combat. The Iraqi Air Force that had looked so formidable on paper simply disintegrated when it faced modern American air power and the pilots who knew how to use it. By the 10th day of the war, what remained of the Iraqi Air Force began fleeing across the border into Iran, pilots choosing internment in a country that had been their enemy just 2 years earlier over certain death in the skies above their own country. More than 100 Iraqi aircraft escaped to Iran and never returned. The Iraqi pilots who stayed and tried to fight were systematically hunted down and killed. Captain Cesar Rodriguez scored 2 kills during Desert Storm, including a memorable engagement on January 19th that was the only real dogfight of the entire war. Rodriguez found himself in a turning fight with a MiG-29, the 2 aircraft spiraling down toward the desert floor as each pilot tried to gain an advantage. The MiG-29 was highly maneuverable and a worthy opponent at close range, but the Iraqi pilot made a fatal mistake, attempting a split S maneuver at 2,000 feet that left him no room to recover. Rodriguez watched the MiG impact the desert and cartwheel for several miles, destroyed without a shot being fired, killed by a combination of aggressive American tactics and the pilot's own desperation. With air superiority achieved in the first week, the coalition turned its attention to the Iraqi army. This was the part of the campaign that John Warden had wanted to skip, but Chuck Horner and the Black Hole planners understood that the ground forces couldn't be ignored. Phase 3 of the air campaign focused on cutting the Iraqi army off from its supplies, destroying bridges, ammunition depots, and fuel storage facilities throughout Kuwait and southern Iraq. Phase 4 was a sustained bombing campaign against the Iraqi troops themselves, hitting everything from tanks and artillery to command bunkers and troop concentrations. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the aircraft the Air Force had been planning to retire before the invasion, proved invaluable in this phase of the war. The A-10 was ugly and slow, despised by an Air Force that preferred sleek, supersonic fighters, but it was designed specifically for one mission: destroying tanks. Its GAU-8 Avenger cannon fired armor-piercing depleted uranium shells at a rate of nearly 4,000 rounds per minute, and its airframe was built to survive ground fire that would destroy more fragile aircraft. 10 pilots flew low and slow over the desert, hunting Iraqi armor with a persistence and lethality that terrified enemy tank crews. General Schwarzkopf had specifically requested A-10s despite Air Force resistance, and they proved their worth in combat. The air campaign lasted 39 days before the ground war began, and by the time coalition forces crossed the border on February 24, 1991, the Iraqi army in Kuwait had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Entire divisions had been destroyed or rendered combat ineffective by the constant bombing. Supply lines were cut, communications were severed, and the morale of Iraqi soldiers who had spent weeks being bombed without any ability to fight back had completely collapsed. The transformation was remarkable. At the beginning of the air campaign, the Iraqi army was a formidable force, battle-hardened from 8 years of war with Iran, equipped with modern Soviet weapons, dug into elaborate defensive positions that would have cost the coalition dearly in a frontal assault. 6 weeks later, those same units were surrendering en masse, often to journalists or helicopter crews, because they were so desperate to escape the bombing. Prisoners of war told interrogators that the airstrikes had broken their will to fight, that they had endured Iranian human wave attacks without flinching, but couldn't endure the relentless pounding from aircraft they couldn't see and couldn't fight back against. The effectiveness of the air campaign in degrading Iraqi ground forces is one of the most debated aspects of Desert Storm among military historians. Some argue that air power alone effectively won the war before the ground campaign even started, that the 100 hours of ground combat were merely a mopping-up operation against an already defeated enemy. Others contend that the air campaign's impact on Iraqi ground forces has been exaggerated, that many Iraqi units were still largely intact when the ground war began, and that the rapid coalition victory was due as much to superior training and leadership as to the attrition caused by bombing. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and the debate continues more than 3 decades later. What is not debated is the psychological impact of the air campaign on Iraqi soldiers. Every prisoner of war, every defector, every piece of human intelligence collected during and after the war told the same story. The bombing had broken the Iraqi army's will to fight. Men who had survived the worst Iran could throw at them couldn't endure 6 weeks of being bombed without any way to strike back. The constant fear, the inability to sleep, the knowledge that death could fall from the sky at any moment without warning, all of it combined to shatter morale and unit cohesion in ways that even the most hardened veterans couldn't resist. By the time the ground war started, many Iraqi soldiers had already decided to surrender at the first opportunity. What happened next wasn't really a battle. It was a 100-hour pursuit of a broken army that was trying to surrender or flee. Coalition ground forces swept through Iraqi defenses that had been so thoroughly shattered by air power that many units couldn't even offer token resistance. The famous left hook maneuver, General Schwarzkopf's sweeping flanking attack through the desert to the west of the Iraqi fortifications, caught the enemy completely by surprise and cut off their line of retreat. Iraqi soldiers surrendered by the tens of thousands, overwhelming the coalition's ability to process and care for prisoners of war. Units that had been designated to fight ended up being used as prison guards because there simply weren't enough military police to handle the flood of surrendering Iraqis. The elaborate fortifications along the Saudi border, those supposedly impenetrable sand walls that had worried planners for months, were simply bypassed as the coalition forces swung around them. The engineers, who had been trained to breach those obstacles under fire, never had to use their skills because the army just went around them. It was a stunning demonstration of operational maneuver warfare, of using speed and flexibility to avoid enemy strength and exploit enemy weakness, made possible by the weeks of air campaign that had degraded Iraqi command and control to the point where they couldn't respond effectively to the coalition's movements. The famous Highway of Death, where coalition aircraft caught an Iraqi convoy trying to flee Kuwait City and destroyed hundreds of vehicles in a matter of hours, became an enduring image of what modern air power could accomplish against a conventional army caught in the open. The photographs of that road, mile after mile of burned-out tanks and trucks and buses, were shocking in their violence and yet somehow antiseptic in their remoteness from human suffering. The bodies had been removed or consumed by fire by the time the photographers arrived, leaving only the twisted metal remains of Saddam's retreating army stretched across the desert like the skeleton of some enormous beast. By February 28, 1991, Kuwait was liberated, and President Bush declared a ceasefire. The war had lasted 43 days, of which only 100 hours involved ground combat. Coalition casualties were astoundingly low, fewer than 300 killed in action compared to pre-war estimates that had predicted thousands or tens of thousands of American dead. Iraqi losses were catastrophic, though exact numbers remain disputed, with estimates ranging from 20,000 to 100,000 military deaths and thousands more civilian casualties from the bombing of infrastructure and the subsequent humanitarian crisis. The carefully prepared hospital ships and medevac operations that had been positioned for mass casualties were barely used. The 20,000 hospital beds that General Schwarzkopf had ordered, the elaborate medical infrastructure that had been established in anticipation of a bloody war of attrition, sat largely empty, while the ground forces swept through Kuwait in a campaign that seemed more like a training exercise than actual combat. The air campaign flew more than 100,000 sorties and dropped 88,000 tons of bombs, destroying Iraq's military infrastructure, its command and control network, and a significant portion of its army in the field. Coalition air losses were under 0.1%, a casualty rate so low that it fundamentally changed expectations about what air power could achieve. The Gulf War Air Power Survey, the official post-war analysis, concluded that air power had been the decisive factor in the coalition victory. And while historians continue to debate the relative contributions of the air and ground campaigns, there's no question that what happened in the skies over Iraq in January and February 1991 marked a turning point in military history. John Warden's Instant Thunder plan had evolved into something far more comprehensive and effective than what he had originally proposed. But the core concept, the idea that you could paralyze an enemy by attacking his brain rather than his body, had been validated in the most dramatic possible way. The tactics and technologies developed for Desert Storm became the template for American air campaigns for the next 3 decades, from the Balkans to Afghanistan to the Second Iraq War. The F-117 stealth fighter, the AWACS command and control aircraft, the precision-guided munitions that could hit individual buildings rather than entire city blocks, the integration of air and ground operations through sophisticated planning and real-time communication, all of it came together in Desert Storm and changed how America projects power around the world. General Chuck Horner, the man who had taken Warden's theory and turned it into operational reality, later wrote a book about the campaign with Tom Clancy called Every Man a Tiger. In it, Horner gave credit where it was due to the pilots who flew into the most heavily defended airspace in the region night after night, to the planners who worked 18-hour days building the air tasking orders that coordinated thousands of aircraft, to the maintainers who kept the planes flying under brutal conditions, and to the senior leaders who had the wisdom to let the professionals do their jobs without micromanaging every decision. Horner was particularly proud that the senior military leadership, from Schwarzkopf on down, had trusted the air planners to execute the campaign without constant interference from Washington, a stark contrast to the political micromanagement that had hamstrung operations in Vietnam. The first President Bush understood something that some of his successors would forget, that the way to win a war is to assemble the best military professionals you can find, give them clear objectives and the resources they need, and then get out of their way. The legacy of Operation Desert Storm is complicated. Saddam Hussein remained in power, his army was rebuilt, and the United States found itself back in Iraq 12 years later to finish what the First Gulf War had started. The precision of American air power created expectations that future conflicts would be equally clean and decisive, expectations that were not always met when the enemy adapted, or when the political objectives were less clear than driving an occupying army out of a neighboring country. The revolution in military affairs that Desert Storm seemed to herald turned out to be less revolutionary than some enthusiasts believed, and the idea that air power alone could win wars proved to be an oversimplification when applied to counterinsurgency operations against enemies who didn't mass in the open to be bombed. But none of that diminishes what was accomplished in the skies over Iraq in 1991. The men who flew those missions, the planners who designed them, the commanders who executed them, they did something remarkable. They took an air force that had been built to fight the Soviet Union and applied it with devastating effectiveness against a regional power that had the fourth largest army in the world. They achieved air supremacy in a week, destroyed an integrated air defense network in days, and rendered one of the largest military forces in the Middle East combat ineffective through the sustained application of air power before a single American ground soldier crossed the border. Whatever else happened after, that achievement stands. The lesson of Desert Storm is not that air power can solve every problem or win every war. The lesson is that when properly applied, with overwhelming force and precise targeting and coordination between services and integration of new technologies with sound doctrine, air power can be decisive in ways that even its most ardent proponents had barely imagined. John Warden sketched out the basic concept on a yellow pad in August 1990. Chuck Horner and the Black Hole planners turned it into operational reality. And the pilots of the coalition air forces, flying into the teeth of Iraqi air defenses night after night, proved that the theory actually worked when it mattered most. That's the story of Instant Thunder and the air campaign that followed it. That's how a war was won from the sky. For those who planned it, those who flew it, and those who made it possible through months of preparation and deployment, the Gulf War air campaign was the vindication of everything they believed about what air power could accomplish. For those who study military history, it remains one of the most impressive demonstrations of combined arms warfare in the modern era. And for those who simply want to understand how wars are fought and won in the age of precision weapons and networked command and control, Desert Storm is where the modern era began. We haven't forgotten the men who flew those missions, the 38 coalition aircraft that were lost, and the crew members who died in them. We haven't forgotten that war, even high-tech war, even war that looks clean and surgical on television, is still war, with all the tragedy and sacrifice that entails. But we also remember what they achieved, those airmen and soldiers and sailors and Marines who came together from nearly 30 nations to reverse an act of naked aggression and liberate a country that had been conquered by its neighbor. They did it with air power that had never been used so effectively before, and they changed the world in the process. That's the legacy of Desert Storm. That's the story worth telling. But let's go deeper into what it actually felt like to be part of that campaign, because the statistics and the strategic analysis only tell you so much. The human element, the experience of flying into combat night after night against an enemy that wanted to kill you, that's what makes these stories worth preserving. The strike packages that flew into Iraq were precisely orchestrated formations that could stretch for 40 miles through the sky. Dozens of aircraft each with a specific role to play in the overall mission. At the front were the air-to-air fighters, the F-15C Eagles, whose job was to sweep the sky clear of enemy aircraft and protect everything behind them. Next came the Wild Weasels, the F-4G aircraft specifically designed to locate and destroy surface-to-air missile sites, drawing enemy fire and then responding with HARM missiles that would follow the radar beam back to its source. Behind the Weasels came the radar jammers, EF-111 Ravens, whose powerful electronic systems could confuse and blind enemy radar operators. And behind all of them came the strike aircraft themselves, the F-16 Fighting Falcons and F-15E Strike Eagles, and Navy FA-18 Hornets that carried the bombs to the targets. Finally, another flight of Wild Weasels and air-to-air fighters brought up the rear, protecting the package as it egressed from enemy airspace. Coordinating all of this was the E-3 AWACS, the Airborne Warning and Control System aircraft that could see everything happening in the sky for hundreds of miles in every direction, and direct friendly aircraft to intercept threats before they became dangerous. The AWACS was the quarterback of the air war, and without it, the kind of precise coordination that made Desert Storm possible would have been unthinkable. The Boeing 707 airframe might have looked like a civilian airliner, but the rotating radar dome on top of the aircraft and the consoles inside packed with the most sophisticated electronics in the world made it the most important aircraft in the coalition inventory. Iraqi pilots learned to fear the calls from AWACS controllers because those calls meant an F-15 was being vectored onto them, and death was moments away. The F-15 was the undisputed king of the air during Desert Storm, and the pilots who flew it understood exactly what they had in their hands. The aircraft was big and heavy, weighing upwards of 60,000 pounds when fully loaded, which would have been a disadvantage in a close-quarters dogfight. But modern air combat was rarely a close-quarters game anymore. The AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missile could destroy targets from 25 miles away, and the F-15's APG-63 radar could detect and track enemy aircraft from even farther than that. By the time an Iraqi pilot knew he was in trouble, the missile was already in the air, and there wasn't much he could do about it. The F-15's cockpit was designed around the concept of keeping the pilot's eyes outside the aircraft and his hands on the controls. The hands-on throttle and stick system, known as HOTAS, put all the essential combat controls within reach of the pilot's fingers without requiring him to look down at the instrument panel or reach around the cockpit for switches. Everything he needed to fight the aircraft, to switch between air-to-air missiles, to select radar modes, to deploy countermeasures, all of it was right there under his fingertips. This seemingly simple innovation made a huge difference in combat, where the pilot, who had to look away from the fight to find a switch, might never look back up again. Pilots described the F-15 as the kind of airplane you'd marry rather than have an affair with. It was reliable and dependable, never doing anything unpredictable, never betraying you when things got difficult. You could fly it straight up until you ran out of airspeed, and it would just tumble around harmlessly before you pushed the nose over and got flying again. The F-16 was more exciting, more agile, the kind of airplane you'd want for a mistress if you were into that sort of thing. But when your life was on the line, when you were flying into combat against an enemy that wanted to kill you, you wanted the F-15. You wanted that big airplane with the 2 engines and the powerful radar and the missiles that could reach out and touch someone from 25 miles away. The F-16 Fighting Falcon flew more sorties during Desert Storm than any other aircraft. More than 13,000 combat missions, dropping more than 20,000 tons of bombs. It was supposed to be the workhorse of the air campaign, the aircraft that would destroy Iraqi ground forces and infrastructure while the F-15s kept the sky clear. But the F-16's performance was disappointing compared to expectations. And the reasons tell you something important about the difference between how aircraft perform in peacetime exercises and how they perform in actual combat. The fundamental problem was precision guidance. The F-16 was designed as a clear-weather daytime aircraft, competitive for visual bombing runs, where the pilot could see the target and put the bomb exactly where it needed to go. But Desert Storm was fought in some of the worst weather the region had seen in a decade, with low cloud ceilings and poor visibility that made visual bombing almost impossible for extended periods. And there was a critical shortage of the targeting pods that would have allowed F-16s to use laser-guided bombs in bad weather. Without those pods, F-16 pilots were stuck dropping dumb bombs from high altitude, above the effective range of Iraqi anti-aircraft artillery, but also above the altitude where unguided bombs could be delivered with any real accuracy. The A-10 Thunderbolt II had no such problems with precision. The A-10 was designed to fly low and slow, to get close to the target and stay there until the job was done, absorbing damage that would destroy any other aircraft and keeping on fighting. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon that formed the heart of the A-10's weapons system was the most powerful gun ever mounted on an aircraft, a 30mm rotary cannon that fired depleted uranium armor-piercing shells at nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. The entire aircraft was essentially built around that gun, with the twin engines mounted high on the fuselage to keep them away from ground fire and debris, the cockpit surrounded by a titanium bathtub that could withstand direct hits from 23mm anti-aircraft rounds, and redundant flight control systems that could keep the aircraft flyable even after taking severe damage. The Air Force had never loved the A-10. It was ugly and slow and specialized in a mission that the Air Force would prefer not to have: close air support for ground troops, a mission that the Air Force considered more appropriate for the Army's helicopters than for Air Force jets. Before the Gulf War, the Air Force had been planning to retire the entire A-10 fleet and hand the close air support mission over to other aircraft. General Schwarzkopf's insistence that he needed tank killers in theater saved the Warthog from the scrap heap, and the aircraft proved its worth in combat in ways that even its supporters hadn't anticipated. A-10 pilots flew into the teeth of Iraqi air defenses, hunting tanks and armored vehicles and artillery pieces with a relentless persistence that broke the back of the Iraqi army. They flew at altitudes where enemy gunners could actually see them and shoot at them, taking hits that would have destroyed any other aircraft and limping back to base to be patched up and sent out again. The A-10 was everything the Air Force didn't want to admit it needed: a slow, ugly, specialized aircraft that was devastatingly effective at one specific mission. The Navy brought its own air power to the fight, launching strikes from 6 carrier battle groups positioned in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea. The F/A-18 Hornet was the Navy's workhorse, a versatile aircraft that could fight in the air, attack targets on the ground, and defend the fleet against a variety of threats, all in a single mission. The Hornet was proof that you didn't need a dedicated air superiority fighter to achieve air superiority, that a well-designed multi-role aircraft could do the job, if the pilots were properly trained and the tactics were sound. Navy F/A-18 pilots flew both air-to-air and air-to-ground missions during the campaign, switching roles as the situation demanded, with a flexibility that single-role aircraft simply couldn't match. The Navy also brought the A-6 Intruder, an all-weather attack aircraft that could deliver precision munitions in conditions that grounded lesser aircraft. The A-6 was old, having first flown in the early 1960s, but it was equipped with sophisticated navigation and targeting systems that made it one of the most accurate bomb trucks in the inventory. And the EA-6B Prowler, the electronic warfare variant of the Intruder, played a crucial role in suppressing Iraqi air defenses, jamming radar and communication systems to protect the strike aircraft that followed behind. The B-52 Stratofortress, the mighty Buff that had been the backbone of America's strategic nuclear deterrent for decades, found a new role in Desert Storm as a conventional bomber of devastating capability. 7 B-52s flew the longest combat mission in history on the first night of the war, a 35-hour round trip from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana to the skies over Iraq and back again, launching cruise missiles against strategic targets before turning around and flying all the way home. Later in the campaign, B-52s flew arc-light missions against Iraqi troop concentrations, dropping massive loads of conventional bombs that cratered the desert and shattered the morale of Iraqi soldiers who had no way to fight back against death that fell silently from 40,000 feet. The psychological impact of B-52 strikes was enormous, out of all proportion to the actual physical damage they caused. Iraqi prisoners of war consistently reported that the B-52 attacks were the most terrifying thing they had experienced, that the earth seemed to come apart beneath them when the bombs hit, that men who had survived Iranian human wave attacks during the 8-year war broke down and wept after enduring a buff strike. The B-52 wasn't a precision weapon, not by the standards of the F-117 or even the F-15E. But precision wasn't always what you needed. Sometimes you needed to put the fear of God into an enemy army, and for that mission, nothing worked better than 500,000 pounds of high explosive falling out of the sky on your position. The Apache helicopters that had opened the war with Task Force Normandy continued to play a crucial role throughout the campaign. The AH-64 Apache was the Army's premier attack helicopter, equipped with sophisticated night vision and targeting systems that allowed it to operate effectively in complete darkness. Its primary weapon was the AGM-114 Hellfire missile, a laser-guided anti-tank weapon that could destroy armored vehicles from ranges up to 5 miles. Apaches hunted Iraqi armor with a patience and persistence that tank crews found absolutely terrifying, appearing out of the darkness, firing missiles that struck with unerring accuracy, and then vanishing again before anyone could shoot back. The Apache was designed to fight Soviet tank divisions on the plains of Central Europe, and it turned out to be perfectly suited for destroying Iraqi armor in the desert. The technology that made Desert Storm possible was the culmination of decades of development, much of it driven by the need to counter the Soviet threat that had dominated American military planning since the end of World War II. The precision-guided munitions that allowed single bombs to destroy single targets, the stealth technology that made aircraft invisible to radar, the airborne early warning systems that gave commanders a god's-eye view of the battlefield. All of it had been developed with the Soviets in mind. When the Soviet Union collapsed just months before Desert Storm, some observers wondered whether all that expensive technology was really necessary anymore. Desert Storm answered that question definitively. The technology worked better than anyone had expected, and it worked against an enemy that was equipped with Soviet weapons and trained by Soviet advisors. If there had been any doubt about whether American military technology was worth the enormous investment, Desert Storm settled the argument. But technology alone didn't win the war. The coalition forces had better equipment than the Iraqis, there was no question about that. But they also had better training, better leadership, better logistics, better morale, and better tactics. The American military that fought Desert Storm was the product of a 15-year rebuilding effort that had begun after the disasters of Vietnam, a systematic transformation that had touched every aspect of how the services recruited, trained, equipped, and led their people. The all-volunteer force that replaced the draft army of Vietnam was smaller but far more professional, filled with soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines who had chosen to serve and who took their jobs seriously. The training revolution that followed Vietnam, with its emphasis on realistic combat exercises and honest after-action reviews, produced leaders who actually knew how to fight rather than just how to manage peacetime bureaucracies. And the procurement reforms that came out of the disasters of the 1970s, the $100 hammers and the toilet seats that cost more than most people's cars, produced an acquisition system that could actually deliver advanced weapons systems that worked as advertised. Desert Storm was the vindication of all that effort, the demonstration that the reforms had worked, and that the American military was once again capable of projecting power decisively against any adversary in the world. The veterans who fought Desert Storm remember it differently than the civilians who watched it on television. For the viewers at home, it was a video game war, a spectacle of high-tech destruction that seemed almost bloodless compared to the jungle combat of Vietnam or the trench warfare of World War I. The precision-guided bomb footage that became the signature image of the campaign, those black-and-white infrared videos showing crosshairs centered on a building that then disappeared in a flash of light, made war look clean and surgical, almost easy. But the pilots who flew those missions knew better. They knew what it felt like to fly into a sky full of anti-aircraft fire, tracers arcing up from every direction, knowing that one lucky hit could turn their aircraft into a fireball. They knew what it felt like to sit in the cockpit during the long flight home, hands shaking from adrenaline, wondering if their wingman had made it through. They knew what it felt like to hear that one of the guys from their squadron hadn't come back, to know that somewhere in the Iraqi desert, a friend was dead or captured or trying to evade enemy patrols. The war wasn't bloodless for them, even if it looked that way on CNN. One pilot described the first night over Baghdad as more exciting than anything he had ever experienced, with the Iraqis shooting more bullets than he thought had ever been made. Another talked about the severe tremors that overtook his body after a close engagement, his hands shaking so badly that he thought something was wrong with the aircraft before he realized the vibrations were coming from inside himself. Combat does that to people, even when they win, even when they come home safe. The human cost of Desert Storm was remarkably low by the standards of previous wars, but it was still a cost, paid by the families of the 300 coalition service members who didn't come home, and by the thousands of Iraqi soldiers and civilians who died in the bombing. That's the full story of the Desert Storm air campaign, from John Warden's yellow pad to the final ceasefire on February 28, 1991. It's a story of innovation and adaptation, of theories tested in combat and found to be largely sound, of technology that exceeded expectations and human courage that matched the technology. It's a story worth remembering, not because war is glorious or because killing is something to celebrate, but because the men and women who fought this campaign achieved something remarkable and deserve to have their story told accurately and completely. For everyone who served in Desert Storm, for the families who waited at home, for the students of military history who want to understand how wars are actually fought, this is what happened. This is how an air campaign changed the world. This is the legacy that still shapes American military power 3 decades later. We haven't forgotten. We won't forget.